Please take your seats, we're ready to start. So yesterday we had a wonderful first day and a wonderful film screening in the evening. Some of you weren't here yesterday, so I'll introduce myself as well in the beginning. I'm Anders Gazagap. I'm the Chair of Estonian Studies at the University of Toronto, a chair which exists thanks to the efforts of the Estonian refugee community in Canada. I'm also one of the co-organizers here, and the first panel that we're having today is focusing on Baltic archives, and it's a true Baltic panel in the original sense of the word Baltic, in that it includes Estonians, Latvians, and Baltic Germans. And now I will introduce the first speaker, Piret, who is the main organizer of the conference.
Piret?
Oh, sure. Oh no, I did this yesterday too. I'm constantly confusing Tartu and Toronto, which are the two vectors in my life. Piret is my best colleague in Tartu, who hopefully will be coming here in a month when we will be hopefully welcoming the delegation of the rector of Tartu University. So maybe that's why she was on my mind. Noorhani, who is the main organizer of this event and most events that happen in the Estonian community at Tartu College. So I'll say a few words about Piret, who has a master's degree from Tartu University, worked at the Estonian Literary Museum, the Estonian National Museum, and perhaps most relevant for the first panel here is that she's the founding member and president of the Baltic Heritage Network, which has been just put together this group of Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Baltic Germans who have been working on our community archives. And of course, her official title is the Chief Archivist at VEMU, Estonian Museum, Canada. But she's so much more. Anyone who comes to events at Tartu College knows that she is the motor that drives everything here. So, Piret, the floor is yours. And also yesterday, some people were complaining that there were difficulties hearing with the microphone. It's difficult for the speaker to understand if they're too far and you can't hear anything, or they're too close and it's too loud. So, if you are having problems hearing, let the speaker know immediately.
Thank you, Andres, for a kind introduction. I have to apologize, I didn't have time to make my PowerPoint presentation. Obvious reasons, you might guess what they were. But I have my paper prepared, and I'd like to tell you about the artifacts we started collecting here at the museum, which we didn't have much before I arrived here 15 years ago. And our collection campaign is on, and there are some information on the information desk and the guest book is, so please take with you and maybe you will get inspired. At the end of August, I visited the CNE, the big Canadian exhibit, first time in my life. Throughout the day, I had mulled over what my topic for my conference presentation could be, and I decided that I'd like to talk about things that we've taken along on the escape journey or were left behind in the Homeland. There is also an ongoing collection campaign, as I said, with focuses on the same theme here at VEMU. And I was pretty shocked at the sight before me at CNE. Massive crowds, noise, bustle were already tiring for an phenometric introvert. But seeing the amount of items, including meaningless stuff, that was being sold, that was really a stark contrast indeed to what I had been pondering and dealing with earlier that day. I'm born 15 years after the end of the Second World War. From a child's perspective, wartime was in the distant past. As I got older, I understood that I'm actually a post-war child. 15 years is a short time. This fact explained quite a few things in my own life. For example, why my grandfather never wanted to throw anything away. Everything had to be kept, just in case, because it could be needed at some point. He didn't collect small things, rather large items, everything that was made of iron, old iron post beds, iron bars and pipes. This pile of stuff in the corner of our yard kept on growing, and this angered both my grandmother and my father. One time, my father and his brothers called a truck to come and pick up my grandfather's treasure, unbeknownst to him. Of course, that caused a huge problem. But the newly cleared corner of the yard was made into a kid's playground with a sandbox and a swing, and so my grandfather eventually accepted it. My grandfather, who had built the house from the ground up in the 50s with his sons, collected things because it created a sense of security in him, I thought. A favorite game that is part of exhibits dedicated to the escape or deportation is one where you are asked to pack a suitcase in a finite amount of time. You have to decide what you will take along. These decisions speak volumes about time, circumstances, and people. VEMU Estonian Museum Canada's collections are the largest Estonian-themed collections outside of Estonia. Diaspora Estonians have been notably successful at documenting and preserving their heritage, and not only in Canada, even though it has been particularly productive here. In our collections we have document archives, photos, audio archives, films, art, everything. And something that hadn't really been collected earlier in Toronto were artifacts. The reasoning behind that could have been that the name and profile of the institution, archive and library. A few items have come via the archives of individuals or organizations, but this was more by chance. But museums also need 3D artifacts to tell stories. Today, there are 2,461 documented items in our collections. We are thankful to our longtime partner, the Estonian National Museum, for their help with organizing and maintaining the collections. Their collection manager, Kadri Vissel, has already visited us 3 times so far to help out, and last time she was here in August this year. Most of you probably know and have an idea how to use archives and printed matter, even oral history and photos for research. But why do we need to collect artifacts? In his book, Treasured Memories, Tales of Buried Belongings in Wartime Estonia, archaeologist Mats Burström states, the memories that objects conjure reach far beyond their own mundanity. The stories draw a picture of how large-scale political events encroached on individuals' families' lives and shaped them for generations to come. The objects often have a way of bearing witness to a very different sort of history than the one found in other types of sources. Sometimes they flat out contradiction one another. The things that people leave behind or bring along enable us to get closer to them, even the vast majority who left no clear mark on the grand narrative. In that context, what might or should interest us is the relationship between grand narrative and small personal narratives. Grand narrative is what is usually rehearsed in historical overviews, and it consequently operates at a very general level, usually a matter of economic, social, and political circumstances. The small narrative is concerned with how the past Piret to individual people and families who were not in the center of power. It tells the story of people and families who only indirectly influence the grand narrative. It is really written down, but instead is communicated in the form of oral narratives to a small circle. Both have advantages and disadvantages, says Burström. Grand narratives have breadth of view and make plain the important casual connections. But they are also a way of depicting the past that is far from how most people at the time experienced it. Small narratives enable us to come closer to people, but since they are based on individual experiences, they naturally cannot be taken to the representatives of the vast majority. Even if each life story is unique, it is clear that similar experiences are often shared by many. People's stories show the ways that objects, by virtue of their history, are imbued with meaning or particular significance. That kind of stories give grand narrative a human face, and only with small stories major events truly begin making sense. I can confirm this statement based on my real-life experiences. When I conduct tours of archives for guests of VEMU, I see two kinds of reactions. People who are knowledgeable about and interested in history are excited, others not so much. But when we make it to the part of the tour where the money boat model received from Sepp is displayed, and you can see it here in our hall, and I tell you the story of a little Kihnu girl's golden childhood and the island and her dramatic escape on a stormy September night, everyone listens, even those that were bored earlier. Artifacts with a story help to make an otherwise abstract history real and more relatable. But physical objects also help in recollection of memories. They are like accelerators of memories. You have likely experienced the following. In the process of moving or cleaning, you come across long-forgotten toys, a meaningful pair of shoes, or a pair of gloves knit by your grandmother. This is a technique that Camille Bundza, sitting here with us today, used a few years ago in her workshop at VEMU, where she encouraged us to share stories inspired by items and other memorabilia that we brought along. Burström cites historian Karin Johansson in his book. To recall the props of childhood is to recall childhood itself. Relics of past days, often the most commonplace and at the time silent, disregarded or trivialized, become as much repositories of memory as the memories themselves. When she received her Nobel Prize, Romanian German author Herta Müller stated that as long as we have everything, we don't even notice how many things we truly have. But in almost all extreme situations, we are also deprived of our things. And the worst situation is when you are deported to a camp where you have not a thing, or prison where you are only a number and can no longer define yourselves through your possessions. The things survive us, and of all the things in the world, we people are most fragile. When you have lived as I have in mortal dread for several years, then you often become alert to such things and out. So, is that why you collected things, Grandpa? People often brought things that were seen to have a particular value on the escape journey. In our collection, we have, for example, a sewing machine, exhibited also in the glass box in the hall, and clothes, bed sheets. Depending on the ways that people escaped, there could be less or more stuff, but even escaped with just the clothes on their back without any kind of luggage. Documents, but also textbooks, for example, were brought along in hopes that education could be continued. Valuable items were brought along which could be used to buy a place in the escape boats or that could be sold later, jewelry, but also money. The items that were brought along could be a testament to what once was. Home and Loved Ones, photo album, guest book, but also hobus, a pass, I don't know how to say it in English, the passport for the horse. Horse was left behind, of course. Something that held a lot of value for a child was a toy. In Bundza's book, The Moon is like a golden ship, translated by Tiina Altama, and which we will hear about a little later today. A story is told of a toy teddy bear named Pets, who a little girl takes along when she escapes and becomes lost at sea, but luckily washes up on the shore later. The happily recovered toy becomes a symbol of hope, not only for the girl, but also the whole boatload of refugees. One of those most surprising things that the refugee packed in the suitcase are an Estonian prosecutor's robes. They belong to the famed August Valdemar Viil, who escaped with his family to Germany and lived in a refugee camp in Augsburg, from where he emigrated to the US. In Augsburg, he worked in the Estonian court system, was the chairman of the General Disciplinary Commission, had a part in the establishment of the Estonian Red Cross, acting as a treasurer, and was also the legal advisor for the International Refugee Organization. August Viil was probably one of the many individuals who hoped to return to Estonia shortly. But life took a different turn. He died in US in 1981. His robes were given to the Estonian National Museum by his daughter. And at this point, I would like to extend a thank you from the Estonian National Museum to everyone that has passed on their family heirlooms to the museum. Thank you. If we consider Herta Müller's citation, we might come to the conclusion that some artifacts can embody human dignity. A comb, handkerchief, bowl, mark, spoon, even book. But for the most part, artifacts that have been kept are vessels of memories and emotions. They are passed down from generations to generation along with their accompanying stories. These are the true and sometimes also secret relics. I'd like to share a story with you. I was on a routine home visit in Toronto to look over the archives of a family patriarch that had passed away. I told his daughter that we are compiling an exhibit about Estonian grocery stores and food businesses in Toronto. Wait, she said, and disappeared into the adjacent room, from which she returned with a small box that had Eesti leib, Estonian bread, handwritten on it. No words were needed. It was a tiny piece of Estonian black rye bread that had been brought along on the escape journey and preserved. It hadn't been eaten. It hadn't been used as a starter for making new bread. It was kept as a most treasured memory and reminder of the lost homeland. I also heard that some brought along Estonian soil, but we don't have that in our collections yet. Does anyone have such a relic in their home? The value of things changes with time. An example would be Estonian language books published in diaspora that are often offered to VEMU. The first generation of refugees bought these not necessarily for reading, but also for patriotic reasons, so that they could support the preservation of Estonian culture. By now, almost no one here needs these books, and VEMU already has all of them in our collections. Fortunately, there is a library in Estonia that continues to accept these Estonian language books that have been published abroad, but their value has also changed in Estonia. During Soviet times, these were not available. You were the real deal if you had a copy of one of these forbidden books. The relics of a generation can become the trash of another if the stories and experiences associated with these items aren't passed along. If their stories are included, they can become a new source of interest amongst descendants or even the inspiration for a work of art. Estonian artist Marko Mäetam created an installation of the items that his father brought back from his visit to Canada in 1980s, and their stories, which were told to the family years later, again and again. These items and stories embody the distant Canada, a free world and ample opportunities to Marco as a child. Madame portrayed this experience that tied together generations and communities within his artwork. Historians sometimes caution that we shouldn't trust our memories too much. However, interest towards the personal stories of individuals has grown. A reason being, for example, that when researching groups whose history is badly or not documented at all, the only option is often to turn to oral sources. And so, in Estonia in late 1980s, gathering of memoirs began so that the stories that couldn't be told during the long years of occupation could finally come out into the open. Through this, groups who don't have a voice are given political weight. Another reason can be seen through Pierre Nora, who believes that the value of memories doesn't fall back on how much they align with what really took place. Rather, they hold importance as vessels of symbolic truth, as expression of what people later choose to remember and single out as significant. The value of artifacts through stories lies within that. But there is also another category of relics, so-called hidden treasures, which were hidden in homes due to war times, in fear of occupiers, or before escaping. Burström's book is dedicated to these stories. Hidden objects could be valuable or dangerous, compromising in the eyes of Soviet regime. Some of these stories are also directly tied to Canada. The extensive personal archive of Professor Karl Laun is stored at VEMU, which tells the story of one of the most important national relics of the Estonian people, the story of our first blue, black and white flag. When the Soviet regime forbade the operation of the Estonian Student Society in 1940, the board of society decided to save this flag that was so important to the Estonian people. Under the direction of the chairman of the society, Karl Laun, the flag was buried. Along with other Estonian Student Society relics in Aun's home in northern Tartu County at Läänemägi farm. In fall of 1944, Aun left the homeland and his escape journey later brought him to Canada. Aside from Aun, the only people that knew the flag's hiding place were his father Alexander and few fellow Estonian Student Society fraternity members, and a couple of family members in Estonia. The historical blue, black and white flag was taken out of its hiding place in December 1991 and handed over to the original owner, the Estonian Student Society, in February next year. The historical flag is currently on display in the flag hall of the Estonian National Museum. Linda Kivi's novel, If Home is a Place, is largely based on her family story. In it, the symbol of the family matriarch, a ladle, is hidden in the ground before leaving home. The story of, for example, the hiding of Iljuma's church bell and others are also known. Some of the items that have been left in Estonia found their ways back to their owner or families years later, when people started visiting the homeland once again. For example, we have a pair of Violeta de Soto's leather mitts, which her daughter Julia brought back from Estonia in 2014. Violeta herself never made it back to Estonia, but her sister in Estonia kept the mitts for 70 years. You can see them at our exhibit. The third category of relics, which Sven was also interested in, are items that were made in the refugee camps, which once again tell us the stories of the practical senses and emotional needs of people. Among these artifacts are clothes and folk costumes, handicrafts that were gifted to others for special occasions, and larger items, such as the massive chessboard with pieces hand-hewn from wood made by Axel Rosman. Burström also admitted that he met people who didn't want to share their stories. In some cases, a promise had been given to not speak of matters, but the reasons could also lie elsewhere. Quote, "The stories involved are so traumatic that it's mostly for the reason you don't want to say anything." All three aforementioned categories of the items are very emotionally charged. Whenever I speak on the piece of rye bread kept by the Yuki family, I have to hold back tears, Burström says. Sometimes forgetting has been a way of getting on with life. Sometimes memories have slowly faded and new experiences have gathered over a lifetime. In Estonia there is a bitter saying, võidab see, kellel on surres kõige rohkem asju. He who passes away with the most possessions is the one who wins. This is a self-deprecating evaluation of the consumer mentality which tends to spread. Those coming from the scantness of silver times can finally buy themselves almost everything. This saying popped into my head as I perused the long tables full of stuff for sale at the CND. Yes, things can have different values for different people in different times. Artifacts that are emotionally charged and have stories are truly valuable to museums, since they help to remind us of and connect more to the times gone by, to people that lived in those times and their fates. These artifacts are an important part of our history. VEMU thanks everyone that has shared their relics with us and encourages others to do the same. Aitäh!
Questions for Piret? Ideas for contributions to the museum?
Yeah, you can connect me later.
Yeah, everyone knows where to find Piret. So, the next speaker is Maira Bundza, who is a retired librarian from Western Michigan University. She has published on Baltic library issues, library reorganization. She has visited Baltic libraries basically everywhere they exist, in collections throughout North America, Baltic countries, Scandinavia, Germany. She has presented regionally, nationally, and internationally on Baltic library issues. She's helped found the informal American Latvian Cultural Heritage Society that works with the National Library and Archives of Latvia to preserve the history of Latvians in the US. Maira, we're eager to hear what you have to say.
I can't figure out how this works. Does this sound good? All this is bringing up just one little personal story. My father wrote his memoirs. He had an outline and everything, and it ended him getting on the boat. So, me, my mom, have nothing to do with, so it's just interesting what stories don't get told. Has some photos from those years, but not. Okay, so thank you, Piret, for inviting me to this conference. And as a librarian, I mostly work with collections, and the way I feel like my story fits into this conference is that it's really important for us to preserve various collections. And this is a big one. And it's actually the first time I am publicly talking about it, because it really wasn't my collection to speak about. I've been working on it for 7 years, and it's finally at the stage where we can let people know about it. So, how is this going to work? So, who was Jānis Krēsliņš? I just found this great quote. It was in the Latvian newspaper just a few weeks ago. He was amazingly erudite and knowledgeable, a man of letters, a publicist, a witness and researcher of cultural eras. He was a bibliophile. I would call him a bibliomaniac, and a bibliographer, brilliant intellectual person with encyclopedic knowledge, art historian, book collector, and a Peruvian at heart, which is his hometown is Ruian, and they call themselves Rudenish. I would also add that he was a poet and a teacher, because he was also my teacher. He would have turned 100 this past August, along with some of his poet friends. He lived in Bronx, New York, and he worked at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he worked in the library and compiled massive bibliographies for them. He also was a consultant to the New York Public Library on purchasing on Baltic materials, and because of him, for a while, it was called the Slavic and Baltic Reading Room. And he also helped Yale purchase Baltic publications, and he himself published extensively. His compiled works were published in Latvia in 3 volumes. Plus, he had a sense of humor. Maybe you can see that in his face a bit. So I actually do have something to relate to specifically to 1944. He was very proud of having still possession of letters that he wrote to his parents from Riga. They were already in Germany. And again, amazing that the post office worked at that time, from August through October. Some of them were on scraps of paper, some of them were more substantial, and this one on the right was written 80 years ago today. And just to get a sense of what was in there, so the families, scanned them all, and one of the daughters transcribed it. So this goes all over the place, but first of all, he numbers them, because remember, you have to kind of keep track. Did you get my last letter? I know that my parents did that in writing to people in Latvia, but this was his 14th letter. He wrote it by candlelight because the electric light was too bright. And it goes between the mundane and the horror of war. And it goes, the shadows of war are stealing closer and closer. I don't know what I will do. But I got some sugar and salt from Dad's pharmacy. His dad had a pharmacy in Riga. And some comments on what the weather was like. And between news from the war, he had found a small article about a literary award that he was excited about. And he asked his parents to write about everything, especially about his brothers. Says he washed his laundry, wish he could take a bath. So that was all in this letter. And I realized that this deserves a whole session in and of itself, analyzing, the things that he wrote about, but not this time. So how did I know Mr. Krēsliņš? First of all, he was dad to my friends. So Maira, who was my best friend from his family, lives in Sweden, has not been over here, so I don't have a recent photo. She's the one on the lower left. Jānis, his son, he's born the same year I am, but I'm in January and he's in December, and so he always notes on the thing that there's 1 month that we're the same age. But he is an archivist in the Sweden, just retired from the Swedish National Library, a brilliant man, and him and his wife are up there, and he's the executor of the estates, so we've been working together closely. And his third daughter, Zuzia, is over here on the right. His grandchildren have come visit him, so there's Mr. Krēsliņš with one of his granddaughters. And that, I think, picture in the middle, that's him as a teacher. He was always explaining things. And he did not suffer fools easily, and he'd always say, well, how did you not know that? And it's like, well, I don't know everything that you know. So the project, this is a kind of a timeline. In 2017, Mr. Krēsliņš had an amazing collection, but he really didn't let people come into it very often. There were very few people that he allowed into his collection. He would show, and then he'd bring you and show it, like wafted in front of your nose, like something exciting that he had. He had researchers. He mostly corresponded with people and found information from people. A lot of people have used him as acknowledged his help in their acknowledgements in their publications. But he got very ill in 2017 and needed to live in assisted living, could no longer live at home, even though his wife continued living there. So his son had come out and asked me to consult and saying, what do we do? This house is full from attic to basement with books and papers and how, you know. And I've done some pretty big projects before, so I said, hey, let's just, for people to even have a conversation with any institution about what this collection is, you need to know what's in it. So it needs an inventory, and I'm willing to start making an inventory. So I went to a shop, made a bit of an inventory, and took it to Mr. Krēsliņš, and he said, oh, this is okay. And he gave me permission, it was a big deal, he gave me permission to continue inventorying his collection, and and I got a key to the house in the Bronx. So from that December of 2017 through 2019, I spent every Christmas break and most of my vacations going out there. What was the total? I don't know. I was out there 9 times, I think, over those years, and did as much inventory as I could. And then, of course, we had 2020 and COVID hit, and none of us could go there. All of his children lived in Europe, so they weren't even allowed to come. And Mrs. Krēsliņš was getting very weak towards the end of the year, and in February we realized that I went out there and got to hold her hand as she passed away on February 13th. Now, he had just gotten hospitalized for some breathing problems. It wasn't COVID, but whatever the connection there was, he died 4 days later. So now the collection was a bit open completely. We no longer had to keep the house as a place where somebody lived, so we could just work with the collection and get rid of all sorts of other things. So then that rest of the time, and during that COVID year, I packaged up the Latvian Center Gazas Library in Three Rivers, Michigan, because they had to tear down the building that contained their museum and library. So 500 boxes. I can do this, banker's boxes. They really need to take a look at what you folks are doing here next door. And I know that it has been a long time coming, but it's happening, so the Latvians need to learn from you. And so I'll show you that the project is actually coming to a close this year. So the process was to inventory. So here's an example of go room by room. So on the left, you can see what it would look like that first November 2017, just huge piles. I mean, once the shelves were full, then you just needed to make piles. And a lot of them were organized. It was just, they start shifting after time. And it was like an archaeological dig. The further you go, the earlier the materials are. And I had to leave things up on the shelves while he was alive because he would ask for stuff, and he'd say, well, I need that book and it's in that room and on that shelf. And sure enough, there it would be. I even did these kind of plans because we wanted to keep track of where things had been. So whenever I made a list or put things in a box, I said it came from this pile or that table or that shelf. But the thing was, when in a house that full, where do I put the boxes? I could stack them only so far. And then luckily, we had Piret came into the picture. And he is a city planner. And he has worked with cultural institutions. He has moved Egyptian mummies, Brooklyn Museum, when they were making some building additions. He's worked with the New York Public Library and the National Library of Latvia. When they built their new building, he helped them figure out how to actually move all their stuff from one place to the other. So the first thing he did was he convinced Mr. Krēsliņš that he needed to rent a storage space. So at least we took the first 100 boxes, put them in storage, so we had a little bit of breathing and working room, and then he came up with this shelving system, he bought these shelves on wheels so that each box, instead of pushing on each other, each box was accessible separately, and it was kind of like a compact shelving unit, so thank you, Peter. So here's the house. This is what it looks like a couple weeks ago. And in total so far, we have 684 boxes. And the books, there's 16,000 volumes of books. 700 periodical titles with 16,000 issues. 129 boxes of archives, plus art, porcelain, ceramics, and other artifacts. So when I made the list of books and materials, I made box inventories. And so the inventories by box it's really hard to get a sense of what's really in the collection. And I did this last year. I'm not going to do it until I have all my lists ready before I do it again and compile all the books together and get a sense of really what was in the collection. So you can see he had quite a few older things. Of course, the most are the Latvian exile publications. He had, things from Latvia during the Soviet era, but also, quite a few books from everything since 1991. He had a lot of things in English, especially about history, the world wars, Europe, Russia, Germany, all those things interested him. And in other languages, including Estonian. There was a little section in one of the rooms for Estonian. Now, this was his sacred cabinet. And I waited until Jānis was there, and we both inventoried that together, because a lot of it was in the old script and in German, and I can do one or the other, but in combination, I have a hard time. So he would dictate things to me, and we would work through this together, and we were just both blown away what was in there. So this is kind of the main shelves of what are there. A lot of religious materials. He had different sections. He really liked, interested in the Hepatians. The 1905 revolution. I mean, there were different sections in this. And just a few. The thing was, we didn't really document all the wonderful books by taking photographs, but a few things I have. So he was most proud of that red leather volume. It's really thin. He got it from East Germany once East Germany opened up, once the Berlin Wall fell. And it is printed on silk, and it is written to the Duchess of Courland. So, just, he did have, it was not in his sacred cabinet, but he did have one issue of the Blick Bible, the first Bible that was printed in Latvian, missing the first and last 35 pages, otherwise the spine still folds very nicely. It's when my son wanted to see something about what I'm doing, because he's not a book reader, so I got permission to bring him and show him this book. Last couple weeks ago, I found this songbook up there. It's all kind of curled over, and then things like there's a book on printing in Japanese from 1808. Who knows? He just had a lot of different interests. Periodicals, same thing. I had to compile them all, and once I had compiled them, then I could see kind of these patterns of what he had collected. So obviously the most things that he had were from our exile and diaspora publications. Interestingly, he had very little from Latvia during the Soviet era, relatively speaking. He had not collected, except for the literary magazine, he really had not collected. But once Latvia regained its independence, he went after those things. To get 2,200 issues is quite an accomplishment. Also in English, the only thing that he really subscribed to were the Baltic, JDA, Journal of Baltic Studies, and other Baltic materials in English. What he had were like single issues that had an article of interest, or some Latvian had written an article in them or something like that. And of course he had Baltic German publications. So here's some of the older, he had, you know, a full run of everything from the Department of Education in Latvia. And this is the literary magazine. It was like called it the Tower of Karuaks, the journal just piled up in a corner. Of course, the most important thing are the archives, because they are totally unique. And he was in correspondence with writers and artists and politicians and cultural leaders in the Latvian and Baltic communities all over the world. And so he had a lot of interesting materials, plus he had other people's collections. He himself had realized that he had something valuable, and he had started putting them in these gray archive boxes. And there are about 90 of those boxes that we've packaged into larger boxes. Whenever I told people about this collection, they would say, "You gotta go find Woody Osling's Suitcase." And I said, okay. And I went looking for it, and I found it down in the basement, brought it right up into drier territory, because actually his materials were in pretty decent shape except for dust. No bugs, no rodents, but the basement definitely was moldy, so, you know, the final place will have to deal with that. Anyway, I found Woody Osling's Suitcase, and it was full of letters wrapped up with ribbons. And we were lucky to get two people from the National Library of Latvia to come and work with those for 3 weeks. And so the woman on the left, Inara Bundza, is a handwriting expert, and so she got through about half of that suitcase, and she was able to organize by, you know, the senders, who the letters were from. Very interesting. And of course he had his own filing system. He had a few series of file folders over the years. This on the chair was his latest version of his file folders. It had one for me too, but I bought a filing cabinet and put them in there as one of the first things I did. So on top of that, I mean, totally it's 129 boxes of papers that somebody's gonna have to work through. An ephemera, you know, programs and posters and images and everything. He was a very visual person, so up here on the right is what was above his bed. He just needed to have art around him. He had maybe about 25 oil paintings and then hundreds of various prints. And so this is not in my category. Petra has been working with that. He has documented all his artwork and has gotten some more expert advice on how to package it properly for shipment. So on his lunch breaks, he would run out to antique stores and look for treasures. And he loved porcelain, and then there were ceramics and just lots of stuff, artifacts of different kinds. So the big question is what to do with this collection. You know, I get that question all the time. I've got somebody, oh, my mom died, and what do I do with her books? And, you know, Piret already discussed that. And most collections, I just go, I don't care about the books, but if you've got some, you know, was she a secretary to one of your organizations or something, that there's some archival material. But this is a substantial collection, and so, you know, and Mr. Krēsliņš could not make a decision. You know, he was thinking, oh, maybe Columbia, because I used to go to Columbia. He worked at New York Public, but New York Public is so short on space. Where are you going to put, you know, 16,000 books? You know, Stanford has an amazing, you know, Baltic collection. They might take the archives, but they definitely wouldn't take the books. And so, of course, there's the National Library of Latvia. And National Library of Latvia was willing to take the collection. Anders Vilks, who just retired, have said yes. And I actually managed to coerce Mr. Krēsliņš to reluctantly sign a memorandum of agreement, just so we have some sort of paper of what we could potentially do, and then we could pass it on to the National Library of Latvia. The lucky thing was that the family was in no hurry. They did not need to clear out the house in, a matter of weeks or months or even years. They could take their time. We could do it properly. We could get it all boxed. We could get it all inventoried, and we could, that was no longer my role. They could make a decision on where it would go. So the destination is Homeland Institute in Marburg, Germany. I've been there twice, and I love the place. It's up on a mountain, on a hilltop, next to a castle from the 12th century, and they are, their mission is to facilitate research in East Central Europe, which means the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Kaliningrad. And they are interested in preserving and providing and access to materials. They have space. They're going to designate a whole separate, not exactly building, but they'll have space for this collection, and they're excited about it. The National Library has a lot of work to do, and these this group here, Baltic and Dietmar, were visiting last fall, and so they've seen the collection, they love it, and they're excited to work with it. And they've hired a shipping company that knows how to do rare materials, and it'll be shipped over there in October, we're hoping. Any questions? And I have to say that it has been a privilege to be able to, I got to work with this man's mind by touching every book that he owned. It's been an amazing experience. Yes.
Sorry. Tell us about a piece of ephemera that you came across that made you either laugh out loud or that was totally surprising.
Of ephemera. Oh, one of the first things I found was the program from the first concert I personally ever attended. It was an incredible string band in New York City. I forgot that. Anyway, and he was there. And I don't have it anywhere, but he does.
Thank you so much, Maira, for this tremendous amount of work that you have done over the course of years. It's just amazing. And you mentioned that some of the items, like letters, have already been digitized. Do you know if there are any plans for a major digitization effort for this collection?
I mean, that's part of what Herder does. I mean, they have a great digitization department. They have a great visual, part of the thing is most libraries won't take artwork, and they're thrilled to take artwork. And it's kind of, he collected all sorts of art from, his interests were very eclectic, and, he had tons of catalogs of rare books and antiquities and art and everything, and so there's interesting stuff there, and somebody will have fun with it.
This was amazing, and it spells everything out so clearly. I just wish there were some people who are quite here today who are in this situation. You have someone who has died, a house full of important materials. Probably some of you know what I'm talking about. Where do you start when you want to do it all yourself? My own feeling is archives. I guess what I'm saying is, if you can't do it all, what's step number one? The most important thing to save?
Definitely archives. Yeah. Definitely archives. And it was a fortuitous combination that I was a friend of the family. Mr. Krēsliņš knew me both as a child and as a colleague, as a librarian. So to gain his trust, and Peter Dievskis was also in that same boat. You know, he knew him, Mr. Krēsliņš, you know, trusted him, and it's been this team that has been able to deal with this enormous collection. And I think and the time factor, that we had the time to do this properly instead of, you know, having to rush to sell the house and get it all out of there.
Thank you.
Mr. Krēsliņš was truly legendary, and I know my parents were one of his daughters, but he didn't mention that he also liked to frequent flea markets. And it was legendary that he said that if you went often enough and looked long enough, you would find Latvian stuff everywhere. And one of his finds was, like this would have been in the 1980s, he came across a 100-year-old embroidered full costume shawl once, and he knew what it was. And of course he had to buy it.
Oh, he had, yes. I mean, I already went over my time, you know, I mean, there was just so much. But we're going to keep talking about the collection. It's time. We're excited, and it's at the point where we can. All right, I don't know how to get out of this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Maira. I'd also like to point out someone who isn't speaking at the conference, but who just asked a question, and many of you don't know her, but maybe Lise, you can show your hand again. Lise, Dr. Esse, is the person who runs the Baltic program at both Stanford libraries. So an interesting person to get to know during the coffee break. But let's come to our final speaker, Petra Grantham, who is the president of the Canadian Baltic Immigrant Aid Society, which represents Baltic Germans in North America. Petra is also a founding partner of the collaborative group Baltic Canadian Imprints, which promotes, captures, and preserves the lived experience of Baltic immigrants in Canada. Her passion is heritage preservation, and she's actively involved in collecting and digitizing cultural materials from members of her organization with the goal of building a sustainable archive. Petra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for attending. I'd like to share with you today the story of Baltic Germans in Canada, who they are, their history, their challenges, and the collection and preservation of their life experiences. We will first watch a short video produced by Baltic Canadian Imprints. Founded in 2014, BCI is a collaborative partnership of Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian and Baltic German organizations in Canada. The video is an accompaniment to the 27-panel exhibit sharing our stories, the Baltic diaspora at home in Canada, which has been touring around the world since 2017. The interviewees were all first-generation Canadians reflecting on their experiences leaving the Baltic and coming to Canada as immigrants. So, there you go. Thank you. I'm so glad to help you. All right, so CBIAS, who are we? Baltic Germans in Canada are represented by the non-profit organization, Canadian Baltic Immigrant Aid Society. The CBIAS was founded in 1948. Sorry. That's better. The CBIS was founded in 1948 to encourage the immigration of Baltic Germans to Canada and provide aid to them upon arrival. Although we have long since outgrown this original purpose, the CBIS remains a relevant, multi-generational cultural organization that supports kinship and heritage preservation. After more than 75 years, the close bond of friendship fostered among the original immigrants continues today among their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. The Baltic German community has flourished. Changing this. The Baltic German community has flourished both socially and economically and represents a Canadian immigration success story. This is our story. Baltic Germans are a German-speaking ethnic minority group who inhabited the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea, in what today are Estonia and Latvia. Descending from Christian missionaries, merchants, and crusaders, they remained in the region for over 800 years and experienced various regimes and social economic conditions. Their legacy in the region includes many buildings and institutions, as well as influences on language, literature, and music. The Baltic German history and presence in the Baltic states ended abruptly in the Second World War. Between 1939 and 1941, a massive evacuation and resettlement operation took place. Following the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after which the German government sanctioned the transportation and resettlement in the newly occupied area of western Poland called Bałtyk, now the region of Greater Poland. Oops, hold on. Yes. The Soviet Union's advance into Poland and Germany resulted in the Baltic Germans fleeing by train, horse-drawn carriages, and by foot as far west as possible. Some were picked up by ships in the East Prussian ports. Many Baltic Germans were on board the MS Wilhelm Gustloff, bound for Kiel, Germany, when it was sunk by a Soviet submarine on January the 30th, 1945. By one estimate, 9,400 people on board died, which would make it the largest loss of life in a single ship sinking in history. My great-grandparents were supposed to be on the ship, but were detained and luckily missed the departure. The Baltic Germans who survived the war and the perilous journeys brought about by two major upheavals ended up as refugees in war-torn Germany, with little means of hope for the future. Most settled in West Germany, some in East Germany, but others emigrated to other locations, including Canada. In Canada, the post-war policy favored immigration and was actively accepting displaced persons from Eastern Europe. New immigrants usually arrived with the help of the United Nations International Refugee Organization, also known as the IRO. But because Baltic Germans were considered German nationals, their immigration fell outside the mandate of the IRO. This meant that they had to find another way to get to Canada. Fortunately, the newly installed Canadian Governor General, Harold Alexander, was sympathetic to their cause and helped set the stage for the first immigrants to arrive by providing a letter of support. Robert Krēsliņš, one of the few Baltic Germans living in Canada before the war, also influenced the outcome of immigration to Canada for the refugees. Together with his cousin, Cecil van Haan, a refugee living in Germany at the time, and the help of his Canadian friends, Krēsliņš organized the Baltic Relief Committee in Montreal in early 1945. This committee raised the funds and sent relief parcels to refugees in Germany. To prepare conditions in Canada and to meet the needs of the immigrants upon their arrival, the Baltic Relief Committee created a separate Immigration Aid Committee, which was tasked with finding potential settlement locations, employment opportunities, funding, and assisting potential immigrants. In 1948, the Canadian Baltic Immigrant Aid Society was granted its charter with a mandate to facilitate the lawful entry of Baltic Germans and provide financial and other assistance for that purpose. The CBIS enlisted the help of the Canadian Lutheran World Relief. It was decided that 10 immigrants would be sponsored to come to Canada, and these Musterknaben, or model boys, would work off their debt of their passage over the course of the year. Their mission was clear. They needed to work hard and be a good model for the type of immigrants Baltic Germans represented. After their work term expired, they were expected to help sponsor others, paving the way for more immigration by Baltic Germans. On August 18th, these Musterknaben arrived in Canada on the SS Beaver. They were young, healthy, and eager to work, and most importantly, fulfill their mission. By 1952, over 800 Baltic German families had arrived in Canada. And 20 years later, the CBIS had over 1,500 registered members. During the first 2 decades, the CBIS established a network of local branches from Vancouver to Montreal and provided financial assistance, advice, companionship to the new arrivals. For the Baltic German newcomers who did not speak English or understand Canadian customs and traditions, the CBIS was an essential support system. Local branches held meetings to foster kinship and allowed members to exchange information and share their experiences. The new immigrants went to work with enthusiasm, energy, and hope, and quickly realized that Canada offered many opportunities for those who were resourceful. Though most arrived with little money, they found employment easily and were willing to work hard and live frugally. The new immigrants found work on farms, in factories, and as well as Canadian industries such as mining and forestry. In recent years, the CBIS has developed a focus on heritage preservation by gathering cultural materials and stories. We also worked to develop ties with other Baltic cultural institutions and organizations, sparking interest of a broader community. 10 years ago, we founded the collaborative partnership Baltic Canadian Imprints. Together with the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian organizations in Canada. Though through the collaborative work of BCI, Baltic Germans in Canada have had the opportunity to showcase their stories as a part of a bigger Baltic heritage framework. Working together with our Baltic partners has provided an opportunity to build relationships between our respective organizations and to share resources, knowledge, and experiences. Since we are engaged in similar efforts to capture and preserve our cultural heritage, we have participated in several successful joint ventures that showcase our shared Baltic heritage in the Canadian context. One of our joint ventures was an exhibit entitled Sharing Our Stories, the Baltic Diaspora at Home in Canada. Based on interviews with seniors about their firsthand experiences of fleeing their homeland, becoming refugees, and ultimately building new lives in Canada. We developed an interview toolkit, recruited participants, and conducted interviews. Where possible, we had youth interview the seniors. The interviews were videotaped, transcribed by our volunteers, and provided the content for the exhibit. Hundreds of people attended the launch and saw the exhibit, which continues to travel throughout the globe. The CBIS has also taken an active role in participating in the international conferences of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. We have presented at the conferences, and in 2023, the Sharing Our Stories exhibit was showcased at the conference in Kaunas, Lithuania, and to the public afterwards. It was a great success. Our challenges. We have no physical space in which to store our materials. Currently, we have over 50 boxes in the custodianship of the National Executive, i.e. my house. And there is much more to be collected as members pass away. We have less than 200 members across Canada, and we are rapidly declining. Our current members are mostly seniors who do not have the expertise or technological know-how required to establish and maintain an archive. It has proven difficult to engage youth members enough to commit their time and effort and impress upon them the importance of heritage preservation. Our only source of income is through membership dues. Our aging membership and no new sources of Baltic Germans have made financial investment in an archive virtually impossible. Since our group is very small compared to other cultural organizations, we have an almost invisible public presence, and it is therefore difficult for us to secure government funding. Although there have been famous and influential people amongst Baltic Germans in Canada, we do not have any high-profile advocates who will support our archival goals. Finally, time is not on our side. We are a disappearing culture within the Canadian fabric, and with little opportunity to reach our archival goals before our financial and membership resources are depleted. Although Baltic Germans and their descendants can be found all over the world, they exist only in the diaspora. Ever since their abrupt upheaval from the Baltics in the Second World War, Baltic Germans have not had a homeland, and we will eventually become fully assimilated into our adopted countries. Their very existence as a distinct ethnic group is disappearing. Our future. There are many positive signs that today's youth will retain their interest in Baltic German heritage, and that they will want to maintain relationships they have formed within the organization. As long as there are active members, there will be people to keep the CBIS going. However, as our members assimilate and the connection to the Baltic German lived experience diminishes, it becomes more likely that the organization will not exist very long in its current form. For that reason, there is a sense of urgency to build a sustainable archive and to lay the foundation for a long-term legacy plan. Capturing and collecting our members past and present, life experiences, and preserving the archival materials that represent the CBIS's long history in Canada is crucial, and is in fact the main project of the National Executive. Our goal is to provide future generations of researchers and others the ability to learn about Baltic German history, society, and culture in the Canadian context. The project includes a digitization incentive to both preserve materials and to make them more accessible to a wider public audience. Finding a suitable repository, however, is challenging. Space, time, funding are the main impediments. Along with finding a safe environment for our materials, we are looking for a host institution that is able to reliably sustain and safeguard our materials for the future. Despite our challenges, however, our efforts to build content for an archive have been underway for over 10 years. In 2014, the CBIS received a donation of materials from Matthias Kusta, a former executive of the Edmonton branch and original member of our group. This donation of photographs, maps, memoirs, and books is in our C collection, and the foundation from which we have been building a comprehensive archive. Since 2014, the National Executive has collected and scanned thousands of documents, photographs relating to our organization's history, as well as memoirs and taped interviews relating to our members. We have also collected a significant amount of books and source materials from donations that will be digitized and added to our archive as time permits. The history of the CBIS is fascinating, and our stories speak of people with strong personal convictions, courage, and ideals, whose vibrant sense of community have, so far, kept them from cultural extinction. The National Executive of the CBIS is committed to pursuing its long-term archival objectives through ongoing collection and digitization of materials. We will continue to pursue new fundraising options and to explore opportunities to promote our cultural heritage and our efforts to preserve it. We are very grateful for the support and friendship we have found in the Baltic communities in Canada and abroad. The collaborative work of Baltic Canadian imprints has helped us all to improve our sense of community and identity within the Canadian fabric. Hopefully, there will be more collaborative projects on the horizon so that we can expand the public awareness of Baltic heritage and our unique history on the world stage. Thank you for letting me share my story of the Canadian Baltic Immigrants Aid Society, and I hope our story has sparked your interest.
Any questions, Petra? If not, then there's an opportunity. Okay, Maira, in the back.
What language do you teach the young people? I mean,
All of our correspondence and communiques within the group is in English, and that is purposeful so that we don't have a language barrier between our adults and youth.
But they still try to learn German?
Unfortunately, not so much.
Okay. Gabby.
Just a comment that recently in the Globe and Mail there was a larger article about how every museum in Canada is screaming for space. So that Maira having an institution to accept material
It's
is
a huge feat.
is really worth commenting on.
All right, now that time is up for our first session, and I can invite you all for lunch next door.